Good morning. My name is Joe Yelderman. I'm a professor in geosciences at Baylor University, and it's a real honor to be here today and talk to you about my perspective of history in Waco, and specifically how the natural resources, the geology, if you will, affected Waco's history and culture. And I've subtitled this From South America to Interstate 35 and Sail-gating at McLane Stadium, just to give you a picture of the things we're going to be talking about today. The little quip down there about boy geologist and part-time theologian is from my mentor, Dr. O.T. Hayward. And I want to mention him because he really was the inspiration for this particular topic and got me interested in this sort of research, if you will. And he used to point out that there's only a couple letters difference between geology and theology. Basically, the natural resources of Waco area have shaped it economically, politically, socially, historically, and futuristically. The picture that you see in this slide is bluffs at Cameron Park with the Brazos River in the foreground. And probably there are not two things that have had a bigger impact on Waco than the geology and landscape and the river that comes through it. So I'm going to proceed to try to convince you of that. And I'm going to start with Waco, if not at the center of the universe, at least at the center of Pangea. And your first response should be, what the heck is Pangea? And Pangea is a name that was given to the sort of Earth continent, if you will, the supercontinent, when all the current continents were together as one. And so they started out somewhat separate and then came together and then have since drifted apart. This all a result of plate tectonics. And so this is a picture several hundred million years ago where South America and North America come together, and you see a yellow outline of Texas right here where South America and North America have come together. And you say, well, that's pretty bizarre. We're starting back about 200 million years instead of about 200 years ago when we got recorded history here on this continent. But if you look at that place where it collided, here's a dotted line that maps what we call the Ouachita Thrust Belt. And this dotted line that you see here kind of goes through Texas. And you might just imagine sort of where that outline would fit on the world today. Up here in this circle between Oklahoma and Arkansas, the Ouachita Mountains are actually exposed on the surface. But here, they're underneath us in central Texas. And that Ouachita Thrust Belt that's underneath us is basically about 8,000 feet below us. And so there are mountains below us. They're just covered with sediment and from deposits in shallow oceans and other sediments that are here where they're exposed on the surface up there in Oklahoma and Arkansas. So what does this mean to us? Well, here is a picture, we call a physiographic sketch that tries to capture the essence of the topography and the landscape if you were looking at it. So it's really a drawing, an artist interpretation, but it's using the topography as its guide. And again, we see that same sort of S-shaped pattern, if you will. Here are the Ouachita Mountains, and here's that sort of dotted line pattern that goes out this way. And the Ouachita Thrust Belt lies along that pattern. Now that thrust belt superimposed on the surface has had some impacts. And here's Waco right in the middle of this slide. And you see this thing called the Balcones Fault Zone. Well, we lie right in the middle of the Balcones Fault Zone. And the Balcones Fault Zone is a zone of many faults. There's not really a fault line like you hear people talk about, or a fault. There are many, many faults. And they're all sort of dropped down to the east-southeast. And the western part is a stable platform that really hasn't moved. And so basically that fault zone runs right through the middle of Waco and has a significant impact as well. If you look at the surface geology, what kind of formations do you have? You can see the Ogallala Aquifer, the high plains, and all the irrigated sandy soils up in the Panhandle. You can see the mountains of West Texas and the Llano Uplift. And then right where we are along that pattern again, it changes from this kind of a pattern to these parallel bands that go up and down and parallel the coast. And they are old coastlines. In fact, the water level was some 300-400 feet higher than it used to be. And the coastline used to be here in central Texas rather than way out here where it is now at the present Gulf. And those sediments that were deposited along those bands have left the geology behind that then weathered to form the soils. And in our particular area, this really dark black portion we see here is the Blackland Prairie. This is an area where marine shales weathered to thick black soils, and they had a lot of carbonaceous material in them, which is very fertile for plants. And so the Blackland Prairies are some of the richest soils in the world, and Waco again lies right in the middle of the Blackland Prairie. So let's talk now about the rivers. We've got a kind of a picture of this Ouachita thrust belt and the escarpment that it forms, and the Balcones fault zone and the Blackland Prairie. But what about the rivers? Look at these rivers and think back about those parallel coastlines, and you see that all these rivers in Texas are running northwest to southeast, where the bands of old coastlines are running northeast to southwest. And so they're at right angles to each other. And the major rivers, of which the Brazos runs right through Waco right here, is really at a right angle to that S-shaped pattern that we talked about earlier from that collision with South America hundreds of millions of years ago. What does that do? Well, it produces situations like this. This is Indian Spring, and the suspension bridge in the background. We're looking at the Brazos River and some water discharging from Indian Spring. And it's named Indian Spring because this was the original site of the Indian encampment here, the Waco Indians. And they had a permanent sort of village here. And the reason they had a permanent village is related to this spring as a permanent water supply. It's much better than the river. Now, you might not want to drink out of this spring, but if you had to choose between the spring and the river, the spring is the better deal. And the reason is the water has soaked into the ground and then flowed through the sand and gravel and so forth and come out at this spring, and it's been sort of pre-filtered naturally. Whereas in the river, there's suspended sediment. So you can see the color difference that exists even today. And the reason this spring is here is shown in this next slide, where we see those sediments, the sand and gravel that are exposed here, and then this chalk, white rock or chalk that's exposed down here, which is the Austin chalk, the same formation that we see in the bluffs in Cameron Park. And these sediments from old floods of the Brazos were laid down on top of this. These are very permeable. They soak up a lot of water when it rains. And this rock is got just a few fractures in it, which are not very wide. And so it doesn't transport water near as well. So the water piles up in here and flows out right along this contact. And there are springs all the way from Franklin Avenue Bridge to the suspension bridge all along there in Indian Spring Park. So when you look at this, this is the source of that, but this chalk is exposed in the bottom of the river. And so right at this same place where we have this spring, we have a hard rock crossing, rock in the bottom of the river, that if you took a wagon or horses or things across the river, they wouldn't bog down in the mud because there would be a hard rock bottom to it. So in most low water flow, low flow conditions, people could cross the river here. They forded the river. And that's why the Waco Indians were here. They were here because it was a crossroads, a place you could cross the river. It was a place that had a permanent water supply. And this sandy, loamy soils of sands and gravels and some silts and clays was a fertile enough material that could be easily manipulated with very crude tools that they had to where they could grow gardens and orchards and have a more permanent food supply as well. So all this contributed to this particular location. And that's why we had people that used this as for cattle drives, and eventually we ended up with the suspension bridge. The suspension bridge was built at that location simply because that's where everybody crossed the river. And in fact, people crossed the river along that S-shaped pattern that we talked about from the beginning of this presentation, where the hard rock bottoms of streams and the thin ridges of thin soils on the ridges made a natural path. Animals used it. Early Native Americans used it. The early settlers used it. Eventually it became the trails for cattle drives and wagons, and they sort of meshed. And they determined that based 200 million years ago, when those two continents collided, they determined that's where we're going to put I-35. That's what evolved into this interstate highway that we now think of as the Interstate 35 corridor. It had a ridge with rock and thin soils and hard rock crossings, and most of those had springs for watering, and there were communities along there. And so engineers might have think they came up with a good place to put Interstate 35, but it was really decided 200 million years ago when South America and North America collided. Now let's take another look at Texas from a simpler perspective. Geologists and geoscientists are pretty simple people, and Texas can be divided easily into the brown half and the green half. And this particular picture has those colors on it, but the brown half is usually pretty brown because it's a drier climate. It's thinner soils out west, and so you have a lot of grazing cattle country and so forth in the west. Even though we irrigate the panhandle now, historically this was a drier land with shorter grasses and thinner soils, and it was ranching country. The green half got more rain. It had more sediment type soils, thicker soils with clay and richer soils, and so it was more farming country. And the green half and the brown half are separated right along that line we keep talking about. On top of that, if you want to talk about culturally, the brown half is the Wild West, and the green half is the Old South. Essentially, the east is south in Waco and the west is west. Let's look at how that Old South had an impact. If we look at the slave population in 1840, you can see that it was down along the coast and along some of the river valleys that extended up into the area, but it didn't go all the way, it didn't go into that brown half or that western half. Over time, up into 1860, the Civil War period, it had increased in population, but stayed again pretty much to that eastern portion, that green half, the farming part. Now, we know that cotton was farmed along the river valleys, and we see the plantation homes that do have a slave history in Waco along the river. But we also know that the Blackland Prairie was a huge cotton farming area. But if you look at the Blackland Prairie and you look at the slave population, it wasn't there. It wasn't in the Blackland Prairie. And you think to yourself, well, I thought the cottons and the cotton production and slaves all kind of went together with plantations and so forth. And in reality, the Blackland Prairie had thick bunch grasses on it, very sticky gumbo soil that was hard to plow when it was wet and hard as a rock sometimes when it was dry. It's rich, but it's hard to manage. And we didn't have the tools to manage it until 1870, which is post-Civil War. So we didn't have slaves in the Blackland Prairie. We had slaves along the river valley and in East Texas. But the Blackland Prairie, we had tenant farmers and sharecroppers. It was a second wave of cotton production there. 1890, you see that still hasn't occurred out onto the prairies. Why? Not because there weren't African Americans out there working in the cotton fields, but they were working for wages, and they were tenant farmers and sharecroppers. They weren't working as slaves in that part of the world. In 1898, we see a picture of Waco that's, I think, interesting for a lot of you here, and that is that we have a very small town, but there's no Lake Waco in 1898. We were dependent on groundwater at this particular point and some surface water from the river. But for the most part, we had a very small community at this time, and we already see the impact of the river on Waco. What is the impact? Well, there's a bigger west or south side of the river than there is an east side. East and West Waco are separate, and they're separate because the east side is the low side and it flooded all the time. There weren't dams on the river, and so the river flooded much more often, and East Waco got flooded a lot. West Waco was higher on that side of the river, and it didn't flood near as much. So if you had money and you could afford to, you moved to the west side and up on topography and lived over there. If you were poor, you lived on the east side, and you could afford housing there, and you couldn't afford to buy land or move to the west side. And because of the history of slavery in this part of the world, many of the slaves, even though they were free now in 1898, they hadn't had an education or an opportunity to gain any sort of wealth. They were poor, and so they ended up on the east side of the river. All this played into a racial division between East Waco being predominantly African American and West Waco predominantly Caucasian. There were some other smaller minorities of of different races and cultures, but these were the two that were most obvious between that. And that's been a history of Waco. In fact, we've strived to integrate that with many different ways, including trying to build Herring Avenue Bridge in Cameron Park, which was very controversial because it cut the park in two, but they were trying to establish at that time better transportation and communication between East Waco and Waco to integrate. That was in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. So post-Civil Rights Act. So there you go. That's the history of Waco. If you take a drive down Austin Avenue, if you want to do this for fun, it's kind of interesting. You can get on Austin Avenue and just drive out toward Valley Mills all the way to the end. It kind of comes back into 84 there. But what you'll do is you'll drive from about the early 1900s, like this picture showed on Austin Avenue. You'll drive there, and as you do that, you will drive along and you'll go into architecture and housing structure that will go about into the late 60s before you get to Valley Mills or Waco Drive. And that's because that was the way Waco was developing, just moving out from downtown, growing westward. But it also began to grow northward once we got the lake. And here you see the effect of the lake being built and people moving out to where they could build on the ridges and look out over the lake, those that could afford to. And it's much more expensive to have a view of the lake than it is to be back on the flatlands in Waco. And so we divided the community this way. And again, we had mostly the poor in East and South Waco and most of the wealthy out here that could afford the larger home sites and the better views and so forth. And that changed us not only somewhat racially and culturally, but it changed us politically. And the reason we got political divisions here was that if you think about it, if you're poor, things aren't going well for you, and change seems like a good idea. Like things are not going well like they are, let's change it up and see if I can do better. If you're wealthy and you're doing really well, you don't want change. Things are going well for you. Let's keep them the same because I'm doing really well. And so the people that were wealthy tended to be conservative out here. The people that were poor tended to be progressive or want change in some way. And that tended again to fall into some cultural and racial boundaries. And if you looked at the politics of it though, this tends to be a sort of ISO-Republican high and this an ISO-Democratic high. If you looked at animal structure, Dr. Hayward pointed out there were a lot more raccoons over here and possums over here. So there was a correlation between Republicans and raccoons and between Democrats and possums, and he didn't know what that really meant. But basically, there was a difference between the old downtown, the new suburbs, Democrats, Republicans, African Americans, white. This all is a result of, in many cases, the natural resources. The river was a boundary. The river affected the flooding and the property values, and the lake affected it the other way in a positive way. So we got so excited about how interesting these things were. Dr. Hayward and I decided to look at some other things, and this was one of the things we found fascinating, and that is that if you look at the state of Texas, on the left you have your local liquor option. White means no liquor, it's a dry county. Green means you're Catholic. At least that's what we thought. And we thought that white area would be Baptist, of course. And we figured, well, that should make sense if we look at the number of illegal stills seized in counties, which is the state map on the right. And so what you see on the right is that one's not divided by an upper and a lower layer, but it's divided by the brown half and the green half. And the reason it's divided that way is everything from Central Texas west is pretty much open land. It's prairie, it's grassland, and at least it was in the past. In the east, you had the rain and you had woods. And if you were gonna make a whiskey illegally, you needed several things. You needed water, you needed wood for fire to run your still, but most importantly, you needed woods to hide in. And there's just no place to hide on the prairie. And so Dr. Hayward's conclusion was that this must have been Baptist, and this must have been Catholics and maybe some Methodists down here. And over here, we look at this, you would think, well, maybe this is the Baptist and this is the Methodist and the Catholics. So we have two hypotheses here, which one is which. But before I reveal the information there, I want you to take a quick look at these two counties right here. This county, and I apologize that I don't remember exactly what county that was, but this county had 703 stills confiscated during Prohibition, and this county had none. I think that speaks volumes when you look at all the stills that were confiscated in the area about who the sheriff was in this particular county and what the sheriff was like in this particular county. So an interesting insight there. But let's reveal now, where are the different religions, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Catholics, etc. And here you go. Sure enough, those Baptists are right across the east-west corridor here. And these are the Catholics down here, and the Methodists are some of these the Reds, and there's some mix sort of along this boundary. But Baptist here, Catholics here. So the liquor option was very much along religious lines. The Baptist non-drinkers voted not to sell whiskey. However, as Dr. Hayward pointed out, if we look again, the Baptist in the woods must drink differently than they vote than the Baptist on the prairies. Another way of looking at that is if you lived on the prairie, you may as well be Baptist because you couldn't have a still during Prohibition. There was just hardly any place to hide one. Well, we thought that was pretty interesting to see how the natural resources affected us in that way as well. Now, let's look at that flooding again we talked about. I just put this picture up there because I want to share this with you about not only the history, but also the future. This is West Waco, and this is East Waco. These red lines are the edge of the flood called the standard project flood, the maximum probable flood, or the 500-year flood. That's the largest flood that we think will probably occur. And it's by a standard project, we usually design for that flood. We design dams and so forth for that flood. We've never experienced one in Waco that we know of, but it's possible. So when that flood occurs, we will see this area in here all underwater. And you notice most of what we know as East Waco would be underwater, but also this Baptist University right here in pink will pretty much all underwater. Now, the Baylor Science Building may stick up, and maybe the Pat Nuff Hall will be sticking out of the water, but it will inundate everything to about 12th Street here. One thought you may be having right now is that, well, yeah, that's interesting, but don't we have dams upstream that will mitigate this flood? And the answer is, yes, we have dams upstream, but the answer is no, they won't mitigate this flood. And the reason they won't mitigate the flood is that they're not big enough to stop this particular flood. They do mitigate smaller floods, and we see a lot of times where the water gets channel full, doesn't really flood, but it gets really high, and it may inundate the Indian Spring or the River Walk or something like that, or parts of the lower areas, but it doesn't get out into East Waco like this, and it doesn't flood the southern part down near Baylor. But we haven't had a big flood in a long time. In 1936, we didn't have the new Lake Waco or Whitney or Possum Kingdom or even Aquila, but at that time, water was about 8 feet deep on University Parks, and it was a pretty serious flood in 1936. The river was 5 to 8 miles wide in South Waco, so that was a big flood. That flood did have a small Lake Waco on it, and essentially it didn't have any impact at all. In fact, it kind of made it worse because the lake was getting full, they were holding back water, and then they decided to release that water at the last minute, which is about the time the storm had moved to the eastern side of the river, was coming down Aquila Creek, and they merged together and actually caused the flood to be even a little bit worse. And we can have that today because our lakes are being needed more and more for water supply, and we're raising the standard pool level and decreasing the flood protection sometimes. Waco did that. They built a little wall on the top of the dam to give us some additional flood protection if it gets that high. But I don't know how practical that's going to be. So the bottom line is the lakes are slowly filling up. They're needing to be fuller for more water. And so our flood protection is decreasing a little bit. And so we won't have the flood protection for a really big flood like this. I'm not here to scare you, but I want you to be aware of the fact that we have a floodplain that's because of the river, which is so important to Waco. It will impact us. It does impact us. It's an asset and it's a liability. We need to manage for it. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, in 1889, Bell's Hill actually got a well that was completed long in anticipation that flowed all the way to the surface. They had tapped the deep Trinity Aquifer, which we have used since that day. But it was so exciting. It took a long time to do that. And they had hundreds of thousands of gallons a day coming out of there. It flowed naturally up into the air and then down to the river. And they just got all excited. You can see some of these quotes. I'm going to share these quotes with you because I think they're a little more interesting, if I can. And that is that we found a pure and infinite water, according to the news the next day, boundless flow, inestimable value, immense body of water, incalculable, inexhaustible. Okay, all those were lies. There is a boundary. It can be estimated. It is immense. I should take that back. That's not a lie. It can be calculated and it is exhaustible. And we know that because that water that flowed to the surface made Waco known as Geyser City for a while. But it starts way out in the west, some 60 to 75 miles west of here out in Comanche and Hamilton County, soaks into the ground and then flows along this little brown and a line down here to that deep aquifer. And when you drill wells in McLennan County down to that point, you get a water that comes to the surface that would be flowing like this. It would come across right here like that. That's where the water level would be. So it's under pressure down here. When it gets really deep, it's not really fit to drink, so it's not as useful. But we're in a great spot right here, and it underlies all of Waco. But even though we didn't know what to do with it, we thought we had this inexhaustible supply. They were so excited. They erected standpipes, and in fact, they erected a pool and so forth. But then they found out, that this water was a little bit salty. It had some dissolved minerals in it. And it had that because it had been in the ground for thousands of years and it was fairly warm. It was 103 degrees Fahrenheit on average. And so now they decided, well, it must have curative powers. It must be mineral water that's of great value. And I love this quote down here below that says, several eminent judges, I guess judges of water quality, thought that the new artesian water is a sovereign anti-fat remedy. And I'll just share with you just what I know about anti-fat remedies, that water is a great anti-fat remedy in general. If you just drink water, you're going to lose weight. It's just the way it works. There's just not enough nutrients in there for you to get fat. So I don't know what they were really thinking, but it makes me kind of silly. But with all those wells flowing to the surface, Waco became known as Geyser City. And Marlin developed a mineral water industry down there, some hot baths and things. And so we took advantage of that resource for a short time, but it didn't take long to where the water level continued to drop. And this is a water level in a well in the Woodway-Hewitt area, which is dropping about 10 or 12 feet per year. And this drop in water level that is approaching 1,000 feet below the surface now was one of the reasons there was a need to create a groundwater conservation district. And I show the logo down below. Southern Trinity Groundwater Conservation District is the groundwater conservation district in McLennan County. And it's been around for a number of years now and is making a difference in trying to slow down this decrease in water level. It hasn't been able to stop it because you can't use the water without decreasing the water level. But the idea is to slow it down and manage it to make it last as long as possible. Here's the cone of depression. These dots said like this is elevation water level. It's almost 2,000 feet out here. As it goes down this way, you get down to Waco area. The water level is below sea level under Waco and under Dallas-Fort Worth area. In Dallas-Fort Worth area, 300 feet below sea level. Here, the zero line of sea level is right about there. And we have a small area in McLennan County. Places where we have changed that to go below sea level. And that's due to pumping. Now, over on the right, I have a population map. And that population map that you see right here is the major cities. And doesn't that remind you of something? Oh yeah, it's that S-shaped pattern we talked about at the beginning of this talk. That's the I-35 growth corridor. And that's where we built most of our reservoirs. That's where we're using most of our groundwater that you see from the Trinity Aquifer there. So we go back to those cultural attitudes. They've changed. Look at the wet, dry part. Everything's part wet in Texas. This white area doesn't exist anymore. Things have changed from the Baptist domination of the early days and people's view on alcohol. On the other hand, there are things that won't change. And what won't change is the amount of water we have and the resources we have. And in this particular slide, I show you one of the standpipes that was in the pool or natatorium in downtown Waco that they just let flow up like a fountain and keep the water level in the pool going, and they let the excess water drain off to the river. And after a few years, that was gone. And it's because they didn't really manage their resources like they needed to. And so we've had some good days and bad days in Waco due to natural resources. And this has been sort of a, maybe not the best, our best day. And it points us to the future as we look to the future. So as we think about how we're going to manage that water, how we're going to manage flooding, how we're going to manage our natural resources and the growth along the I-35 corridor, if we're apathetic to our understanding of those geologic resources and those impacts on our community, then we're in for some surprises. So coming soon someday is talk number 2, which would be how geoapathy might affect Waco's future. I'll stop now and answer any questions that you might have, but we'll have to do that indirectly through chat or email or something down the road. But one question I often get is, how long will the water last? How long will the groundwater last? And that question, I can tell you, depends on how fast you use it. And if I had to do one thing that could prolong and conserve our water, the biggest thing we could do would be quit watering our lawns. And if we're apathetic to the water supply and say, I really like my green lawn and I want to keep watering it, and everyone wants to have a big green lawn in Waco, then we're going to run out of water a lot sooner than if we didn't. Thank you very much, and I hope this has been informative to look at how geo resources, if you will, affect Waco's culture and history.